Well, good evening. Welcome everybody to the Mid-Michigan Manifest Investing topics class. This isn't the roundtable tonight. This is our class where we just talk about things that interest us as far as investing is concerned. Tonight we're going to be joined by my friend Mark Robertson from Rochester Hills. As always, my partner in crime, my speaking buddy, my traveling companion. And we're also going to be joined by one of the best presenters that I've ever had the opportunity to listen to. On top of that, he's just a generally all-around witty person, very interesting guy to talk about almost anything with. Hugh McManus, he's from Pasadena, California, and he's the managing director of a company that helps in the drug approval industry. Notice the title of our little presentation this evening is Pharma Pipeline Opportunities. So we want to give Mark and Hugh as much time as we possibly can. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for being there this evening, and let's get this thing started.
All right, you want this or you want me to do it?
Go ahead.
You can do that. Thanks, Ken. You have this one done.
All right, this slide everybody knows by now, but we still have to do it. No investment recommendation is intended. We will be talking about a few real companies in real time. Do your own homework. Don't simply run out and buy them or sell them because you hear them mentioned here. Do your own homework. And again, just an overall reminder that the stuff we do in our work with Better Investing and at Manifest Investing centers completely on this notion of illustration and demonstration of a process that's worked very well for many people. No guarantees are implied. You guys all know that drill also. But for literally 8 decades now, some people have done fairly well, including the two guys that are here with me here tonight, for sure. If you want reminders about future educational sessions, please email nkavula1@comcast.net. And if you have follow-up questions or would like copies of the slides, please send an email to markr@manifestinvesting.com. All right, we're going to roll pretty quickly through this here tonight. This is basically the chapters of what we're going to take a look at, just this notion of investing in a very specialized area of healthcare. We want to be very specific about the fact that this is going to be talking very largely about non-core special situations type investing. Early stage, and we'll cover that in greater detail. I'd like to welcome you all to our sofa, and we'll take a look at that. Sizzling and fizzling is all part of the drill. Everybody must get drugged. I think that was a song a few years ago. And then Hugh is going to walk us through a number of things, including what investors can look for. If we do have some time for Q&A, we'll do it at the end. But let's go ahead and get on our way. Let's start with why are we here and why are we talking about this? And what you're looking at here is a graphic of the sectors in the S&P 500 going back to approximately 10 years, but going back to March 2009, kind of the depths of that really ugly period, a little over 10 years ago. And from left to right, you see the best performing sectors. And the one on the far right has gone through just a 100-year flood of nastiness. The energy sector has just been pummeled within the last quarter, and that really shows up here. But again, technology on the far left, and then the second best performing sector to investors as shareholders has been healthcare. Specifically, the annualized return for the Wilshire 5000 over that time frame shown is 16.7. The healthcare has actually beaten that by 2.3 percentage points, checking in with an absolute annualized total return of 19%. So that's why when you look at the portfolios of many individuals in our community or investment clubs, you're going to find those sectors on the left very much favored. You're generally going to find companies there more often. Let's talk a little bit about one of the best mutual funds for mining and trying to invest in healthcare. This is the T. Rowe. It's a graphic going back 20 years of the T. Rowe Price Health Sciences Fund. And again, you see a real nice picture from left to right. when it comes to the stock price. A little bit of a hiccup there back during the recession, but you're looking at a fund that over the last 10 years has returned 20% per year, gets the highest rating from Morningstar. And this can be the type of place that we go and we mine for individual holdings. In fact, he was recommended that we're going to come back with a follow-up session to this one where we'll be going into funds like this and looking at some early stage companies and just, where are they seeing the high interest areas in the realm of investing. So we may come back to it. Here's a look at a piece of that puzzle, and this happens to be just the biotechs. This is an exchange-traded fund, an ETF, that does just biotechs. And again, in answer to the question, why are we here even talking about this or thinking about it or listening to Hugh tell us how we can actually seek opportunity here, this is pretty cool. The annualized total return since 2006 is about 15%. And I want you to notice that there's quite a plateau there from 2015 on, quite a flat spot. I think that's why Hugh's juices get flowing a little bit, because there has been a bit of a timeout or a speed bump in the realm of biotech, and that just suggests that there may be some opportunity there that's getting ready to emerge and do wonderful things. I also want you to notice that after the Great Recession from 2009 through 2015, notice that fairly steep climb up to that plateau, and the annualized return during that 6-year period was 35%. That's why we're here tonight. We would love to figure out if there aren't a few of these that we can't sink our teeth into. So this is actually rare footage of Hugh in his realm as a special situations investor. We captured this. No, I'm kidding. That's Officer John McClane in that famous movie Die Hard. And sometimes when Hugh's involved in some of his non-core special situations investing, it can be a little bit like a movie with Bruce Willis. And we want to be honest about that. In fact, Ken would insist that some of this is not for beginners. If you're a true beginner to investing, you want to understand some of this stuff, because some of it is very high risk as well as high return, and we'll actually capture that with a couple of Christmas time messages here in a second. So pretty tough day there, Hugh.
Yeah.
All right, I want to take you back to 2006, just tell you a couple of quick stories. Hugh came to me back in the summer of 2006 with an idea, and the idea was Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And somewhere back during one of those low points on the price chart there, midsummer, we purchased a pretty good piece of Vertex Pharma at a stock price just under $30 a share. And fast forward to Christmas, again, think Die Hard, Christmas 2006, I'm literally sitting there with my lovely bride, and she's sitting on the credenza behind me looking at the family portfolio. And we're looking down the holdings, and she's an investment clubber. She gets this stuff. She doesn't obsess over it quite as much as I do. But she's looking down the list, and she sees this ticker, VRTX. She says, honey, what's that? And I mumbled something about it being a Hugh idea. She goes, well, why doesn't it have a PE ratio? And long story short, she basically decided that she couldn't sleep at night with a company in our family portfolio that didn't have a PE ratio. And we ended up selling it. Here's the situation at the time. Vertex, fascinating company that work with cystic fibrosis. They've made magnificent strides, but this was fairly early on. They hadn't actually caught fire yet. The arrow is right in that end of 2006 time frame, and we had actually bought this company back around this low price on the bar, and we're sitting there between Christmas Day and New Year's Day of that year, and we had a nice little gain. And again, perhaps use the question box. I think anybody should be able to see what was the problem with the company with respect to stock selection guides. Anybody see the real problem here? And in fact, here's your hint. I had to change this log scale to a regular scale to look at it. And these are all negative earnings for as far as the eye can see. So they had negative earnings. You couldn't do a stock selection guide. Wendy said she couldn't sleep at night, so we sold it. And then I playfully told an audience in Atlanta many years ago that I had done this, that we we had actually sold it, taken the gain. The answer to the question, gee, honey, if we sell this and even after paying the capital gains taxes, we can still afford that new furniture for the lower level of the house. And Hugh asked the audience or suggested to the audience that might have been a folding table and a couple of chairs. The moment shall live in infamy. So I thought I would just end that ugly rumor. There is our sofa. We have named it Hugh. And sometimes we call it either Hugh or we call it the McManus Vertex, but that is our portfolio. And by the way, that copy of Better Investing on the coffee table, that is not staged. I brought that home from Mom's house a few months ago, and that is a live shot on our coffee table in the lower level of our house. So there you have it, Hugh. That is not a folding table and chairs. That's been a very comfortable place for us for years, and Wendy and I both appreciate that.
Looks comfy.
Yep, it's been good to us. Back around that same time frame, just a few years later, I just wanted to share it can go the other way. This happens to be Arena Pharmaceutical, and Hugh and I had done some playful research into 3 companies that were trying to come up with the obesity pill. And this is just an example. I actually put this one on the Motley Fool caps, took a whole lot of heat for it. In fact, I was featured in a parody a few years later about, what kind of an idiot would pick a stock like this. I clearly called this out as a Christmas wish, or hoping for a Christmas miracle. And it's been quite a rough ride. I'm actually down 52%, and that's after it went up 16% today in trading just today. So over the last approximately 8 years with Arena Pharmaceutical, it's been kind of a rough ride. I haven't given up yet. I think they gave up on their obesity pill not too long ago. Is that correct to you?
Yeah, it got sold off. The company that bought the pill actually did not do a good job with it and eventually persuaded the FDA to pull it off the market, which I think was a mistake, but it's done.
We'll see. So again, I'm looking for a Christmas miracle, but notice I didn't say which year. So this is still alive. All right, here's a look at what it's actually done over that time frame, and you can see it's been quite the rough ride. So again, the reminder, this is an area of high return, high risk, and you do want to be careful out there as you're stepping into this arena. No pun intended. All right, so with that, let's turn it over to the guy who brought us Vertex and bought us our furniture here. And Hugh, why don't you take us away and talk about getting a drug to market?
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I'm going to go through this in a rather speedy clip, but it's really, the point here is to highlight some key points for investors. And the goal really would be to focus on the drug approval process and how it applies not only to major pharma, but to emerging companies as well. Because it's a very useful educational tool if you're investing in healthcare, which is 17% of the economy. And I think this is something that everyone who wants to be a serious investor in healthcare should have some knowledge of. And we're going to look at what is a drug, where does it come from, how do you get the drug to market, the preclinical and clinical activities that you have to do, how companies interact with the FDA and the key points to look at there, and how this process works, and what an investor should look for in these sorts of companies. So we'll move on, and as I said, we'll be going through these slides quickly. I'm just going to go through a number of books that are good resources for the general investor, and you can get a copy of these slides. This book goes through the drug approval process, gives oodles of examples, is a very easy read, thoroughly recommended by me. The next one is more short introduction, the Oxford University Press series. Very nice, short, clippy introduction, just 144 pages. And the next one actually focuses on the immune system. It's also 144 pages. All of these books are small, compact. There's about 200 in the series. They're all about 1 to 150 pages. They explain quantum mechanics, relativity, quantum chromodynamics. They explain every single topic in about 150 pages. There is one volume that stands out very large. It's about 250 pages. That's the European Union. This book is a great history of Genentech, how this company began. You'll scratch your head reading through this and some of the anecdotal evidence for how they came up with drugs and how they did their work, how they raised their money. It's a really good read. And the next one is... Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, you picked Genentech during the very first stock panel in Schaumburg.
Yeah, Oh, I love Genentech. I think it was a great company. This one's a little bit more technical. I love the book, How the Immune System Works. It's old by scientific standards. It's 5 years old, and there's been a lot of development since then. But it is the 5th edition, so it has been updated a number of times. You can read chapters one by one if you want, out of order. This is, I think, my favorite of them all, The Breakthrough, The Race to Cure Cancer. And when I say cure cancer, one of the drivers for this talk is to highlight the fact that there's a lot of research been done on cancer. I would call it a bubble, and not to bring hopes too high, but honestly, I think in 4 to 5 years, I've been warning my colleagues that the landscape in pharma is going to be extremely different, because they are going to make and market major breakthroughs in cancer, which will render a lot of the development effort today null and void. You could wipe out 25 to 40% of pipeline drugs. And I think it's on the horizon. This book explains why. Now, the first thing about a drug is it's a poison. It shuts down a biological process, and you hope it doesn't do harm elsewhere, but it is a poison. And even though I joked earlier about the president, he didn't actually say inject people with disinfectant, but he was on the right track. A disinfectant will kill a virus. The problem was it kills a lot of other things. And the goal in drug making is to introduce a poison into the body that's extremely specific for one and one thing only and does no harm anywhere else. It's an extremely high bar. Fortunately, I've been able to manage it successfully. And the model on the right is just how a small molecule drug looks. And if we move on, drugs can be as small as 9 or 10 atoms. Hydroxyurea is an example, a tiny bit drug. And by the way, the drug you see up on the top is remdesivir. And they can be large if it's a protein or an antibody. Antibody, I guess, is a protein, but if it's a protein type drug, it could be tens of thousands or even 100,000 atoms. Massive, big, clunky things. By the way, that you still have to go through an electron microscope to see. They are small in absolute terms, but they're large in terms of what a drug is. So moving on, you can hear moving on a lot. Drugs tend to break down, they're either a biologic, a large molecule, or a small molecule, like the aspirins of the world, the remdesivirs, hydroxychloroquine, things like that. And biologic drugs tend to be very large. Molecules, small molecule drugs, naturally, as the name suggests, tend to be small. Biologics are highly specific. They bind to one thing usually and one thing more, whereas small molecule drugs tend to be more promiscuous, and that makes developing them a little bit more tricky. How do you get specificity? Large molecules, they often target things that are embedded in the cell, but small molecules can bind to the surface of a cell, extracellular in the bilayer, the wrapper of the cell, or they can actually get inside the cell, as actually can large molecules too. I got things backwards on the bottom because small molecules are always orally delivered, sometimes injectable. Large molecules are usually injectable. And if we skip along, I'll edit that later. Thank you. Small molecules go through the circulatory system, whereas large molecules can go through the lymphatic. That's if you like, the sewage system of the body. And small molecules can develop high concentrations rapidly. Bit longer for large molecules to do that. How you get rid of them, the metabolism, how they're chewed up by the body. Well, it's mostly the liver, sometimes the kidney, or the excretion process to get rid of them. Whereas large molecules tend to bind to their targets, and it's actually the cell itself will chew it up through enzymes, proteases or peptidases that will chew the molecule up and get rid of it that way. And with small molecules, you get a lot of what are called drug-drug interactions. They can interact as they're transported through the body, through the metabolic process or elimination pathways. The big warning that is always given is that drug-drug interactions are very, very serious. And in fact, about a third of all deaths in the US, in the Western world, occur because of drug-drug interactions. So it's very important when a pharmacist asks you, if he or she asks you, what else are you taking, what other drugs, or even what other supplements, that you try to remember everything and give it as many details as possible. Okay, skipping along. The return on investment in R&D has been dropping. It's leveled off in the last couple of years, but it has been dropping since 2010. This is rather alarming. It's a high-risk area, and it would be horrible for the pharma industry and for all our health. It helps if pharma started to cut back aggressively in R&D. Fortunately, they're not. Fortunately, they're increasing R&D slightly, which is a good sign, but the return on investment has been dropping, and there are various reasons for that to talk about later. Moving along. So I'll go through a couple of buzzwords. One is a protein. Basically, a protein is like meat. Things called amino acids, but if you look at a slab of beef, that's pretty much a protein. You'll see a bit of fat in there, depending on where you buy your meat. But if you're buying high-quality meat, it'll be mostly protein, very lean. You find protein in cell walls, on cell walls themselves, or inside the cell doing chemistry. They're very versatile. There's thousands of different types of proteins. They do all kinds of different things. Sometimes they catalyze. That is the effect, the rate at which a reaction can happen. These are called enzymes. And the proteins themselves have binding sites, parts of the molecule where all the action takes place. So skipping to the next slide, we can talk about, we can look at a cell. A cell is a very complicated thing. Cells in our bodies are really complicated. They have a lot of what are called organelles. All of these words pointing with arrows to them are specific. They're organelles, specific parts of the cell that do work. Down at the bottom, you can see this endoplasmic reticulum. This is actually what targets they target that part of a cell in the liver to reduce cholesterol, and we'll give you some examples of that in a second. But we have thousands of different types of cells, and a lot of chemistry happens inside cells. So ideally, you want to try to get your molecule, your drug molecule, into the cell, although if it interacts with the surface of the cell, that's valid too. It's a target there, which we'll talk about in a second. But generally, you want to get it into the cell if possible. And by the way, the body, each of our cells has a whole series of equivalent of a vacuum cleaner to get junk out of there. So the minute you put something into a cell that shouldn't be there, the cell learns about it and will try to get rid of it. So let's move on to 27. This is a movie, by the way. I was joking. Another buzzword, and I'm giving you these buzzwords because particularly with emerging companies that tend to give more details, you may see these words in passing in press releases or in summaries of the research activities when they're describing drugs, etc. And it's good to know what they mean. A drug can either generally be an agonist or an antagonist. These are things which block a receptor. A receptor is a point in a protein or an enzyme, which protein speeds up a reaction, but a point in a protein that likes to do the work. And you would, generally a drug will block that area of a protein to shut down a biochemical process. So for an antagonist, all the drug is doing, it just binds to a receptor and it blocks a biological response, but it does nothing else. There's affinity with no efficacy. So if you're in a casino and you think a machine is about to pay out, if you've no more coins left, it's like jamming a slot machine so no one else can get to it. And then an agonist does something else. It binds to a receptor, but it actually triggers a biological response in the cell. So it has affinity and it has efficacy. It makes it do a bit of work. That's like rigging a slot in a slot machine so that it pays out even if you didn't put any coins in. Hope that analogy helps. I don't recommend you do that, by the way. And if you do, send me a letter to prison. Always want to get one of those. So the first thing you have to do in pharma is you have to identify a biological process that you want to fix, an illness. You know the illness, and then you trigger back, looking through the biochemistry to see what is going wrong in the body that is making you do X, Y, and Z, that is triggering this illness. Something needs to be targeted. To treat the illness, you need to interrupt that biological process. So what you're doing here is you're identifying what's called a mechanism of action, that if you shut down this one biological process, then a whole cascade of ensuing events will no longer happen and you will not get that disease. So in other words, if you can shut down the process for making cholesterol, you get rid of cholesterol in the bloodstream. So if we move along, and the example is cholesterol because there's this reductase enzyme. It's abbreviated as HMGCR. It's a liver enzyme. It's involved in the metabolic pathway to produce cholesterol, and it's embedded in the cell wall that I talked about earlier. And a statin is a specific type of molecule that inhibits that enzyme. It blocks a specific part of that enzyme and renders it ineffective. Once that happens, no more cholesterol production, or at least minimal cholesterol production. And statins are what's called antagonists. They just block something. It's like blocking the slot machine, so the machine doesn't work anymore. And if we skip along to the next slide, we can see a picture of that reductase enzyme, and it is surrounded by a bunch of different statins. And I'm just doing this a little bit to whet your appetite because of a different talk. We'll go through this in more detail. But one of the things you should look at right up at the very top in the middle you can see that there's O's, they're called oxygens, but there are OHs and O's and another OH. And if you go around clockwise, you can see that a lot of the molecules have that particular pattern of atoms on them. And by the way, you'll see this time and time again, that when you look at drugs, when you look at the molecular structure of a drug attacking a particular illness, and then you look at a competitor's drug, you'll say, these guys look very, very similar. This happens time and time again. That is the part of the molecule that's actually doing the work, that is locking into the enzyme and shutting it down so it can't function properly. So your cholesterol, as a result, gets reduced because the mechanism for making cholesterol is inhibited. So we skip along. There are about 900 validated biological targets, 900 things that if you shut down, it will interrupt the course of a disease. It's a little bit tricky because sometimes if you shut down one pathway, another one will compensate or something else will happen. And a lot of research is done to investigate these sorts of complications. But there's a lot of work been done in companies and research institutes to discover more targets. And pharma companies have millions of compounds in libraries that they robotically screen against targets to see if they've got a hit. It's a very clumsy thing. It's done with fluorescent dyes and magic and plates that have thousands of little wells in them, hundreds really, 396 or 1028 or something like that. And they look to see what is lit up, what is actually working. And you can see on the next slide, there should be a picture of a robot that's doing all this work. These things run 24/7, day after day, screening thousands and thousands of compounds in libraries. And you're just crudely looking for a hit. And from there, you can go and investigate a little bit more. So we skip along to slide 33. I'm going to ask the following question when you're studying a company. It's good to know if it's a small molecule or a large molecule. Is it a protein? Is it an antibody? Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to find out what it is a company actually does, but there are resources out there. If it has an approved drug, there's drugbank.ca, it's a Canadian outfit. They will usually tell you if you put in the drug name or a code for the drug, which I'll talk about in a second, what type of drug it is. Medku.com is a Chinese company that will actually make you almost any molecule you like, even if it seems to be violating patents. But one good resource is pubchem.com. That is offered by the component of the National Institutes for Health, and it's really very good. And if you want marketed drugs, well, Wikipedia, can't do worse than looking on Wikipedia. But another site that's free, although they try to get you to pay for it, is adsinsightspringer.com. And if we look at the next page, you can see the next page talks about the different names for drugs, because you can have a chemical name that seriously looks like a foreign language, looks like Klingon, really strange looking words. But when you're in the chemistry business, you get used to that. The company can have a code. I bet everyone is out there screaming that MRK has to be Merck, VX must be Vertex. And usually it's letters that resemble the company. It could be the ticker symbol. Companies are given generic names, and there are two agencies that are responsible for giving the generic name. Say for Lipitor down at the bottom, atorvastatin is the generic name. So once it goes off patent, anyone can make atorvastatin, but Lipitor is the brand name for that drug. And CI 981 is a company assigned code. And in many databases, you can search by the UPAC name if you know it, the company code, the generic name, or the brand name. And on the next page, I show you the splash page for Addis Insight. Most of this site you have to pay for, but you get an incredible amount of free information. So if you stick the name of the drug in there, I, for example, put in Lipitor, and on the next page, it will show you what comes up from typing in Lipitor. It tells you the generic name, who owns it. It's Pfizer, it used to be Warner Bamford. You can see CI 981 is the company code. If you look up on the top right, you can see what looks like a small molecule. You're getting college credit for this, but by this point, you should recognize that, there aren't too many atoms in that. It must be a small molecule. Now you have chemistry credit. You can see down on the bottom, the originator was actually Park Davis, which merged into a company and became Warner Lambert, which ultimately became Pfizer. And then it lists, right below that, if you look at the class, you go through the words in that class. If it's a small molecule, usually right at the end, it says small molecule or small molecules. And really the world of pharma divides between large and small molecules. There's various different flavors of large molecules. I'll go into those soon. And it tells you what the mechanism of action is. And that's not a bad thing to look at, because you can compare it with other companies and drugs that they have in their portfolio, because usually if it's a valuable target, everyone goes after it eventually. So moving along to the next slide, talked about the mechanism of action. How does this illness develop? What is the biological process for this to occur? And the company has to demonstrate that it knows how this occurs before it talks to the FDA about administering the drug into humans. It needs a reasonable argument for what their drug is going to do to the body. And it needs to know the fate of the drug. The drug, as it's chewed up by the body, produces other smaller bits and pieces. These are called metabolites, and they're formed when the body metabolizes the drug. And they're chemicals too, and they can be biochemically active. So that has to be understood. So you have to understand all these sorts of things before you go to the FDA. And this is all part of understanding the mechanism of action in the broadest sense of that term. So moving along. So what do companies do first? Well, they test the drug, a whole retinue of drugs against a target. This is done in the lab. They may make what's called explosion libraries around the framework. I showed you the Lipitor drug earlier, and all of the cousins that were developed by different companies but look very similar. Many companies might end up with the same looking molecule, but might pass them for one reason or another. And once they've come up with a molecule that they think they like, then animal studies are done. And animal studies are frankly controversial, but they're also expensive. And pharma would love to move away from them, but that is challenging because there's such a lot of information built up in animal studies already that it's going to take a long time before that happens. But it is happening. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just talk about this in a second. For animal studies, you want to know how the molecule is absorbed into the bloodstream, how the body interacts with it, because many of the systems in mice, some dogs, etc., are very similar to ours. And so they look at these under very controlled conditions. And they also do what are called in vivo life studies in animals, and in vitro glass studies as well, systems and cells and cell lines as well, to see what is going on. They want to learn about toxicity, the metabolites of the drugs, and how quickly the drug will pass through the system. And the FDA is collaboratively working with pharma to move away from animal testing. But as I said, that will take quite a long time. And it's important to note that whenever a Nobel Prize is awarded in physiology or medicine, time and time again, it's awarded to somebody who has developed their theory or their approach in animal studies. So they're really embedded into the pharma world. So they are critical, but as I said, the companies are moving away from them. And as I joked about, but kind of laughed, but it's wholly in earnest, in the primate research facilities in the US and Europe, there are primates, chimpanzees, and I don't know if I think they use bonobos as well. They've been working, quote unquote, in the pharma industry for 20, 30, 40 years, testing drugs for humans. And as one friend of mine who actually worked for Vertex for many years, they were struggling over the toxicity of the drug, and they wanted to make sure it was perfect, etc. And he said to me, we can't afford to screw up. If we send it to the Primate Institute and damage one of their chimpanzees, they will never do business with us again. Yeah, because it's not, they are lab subject or preclinical subjects. You know, people grow to love their animals and they don't want them hurt. So moving along, one of the buzzwords, I'll talk about many buzzwords, is first in class. You've come up with a new target, you've figured out a new mechanism of action, your drug is first in class. No other drug has done this before. And the approval rate for a first in class drug is higher, but usually it's the follow-on drug. So that, for example, the first company to recognize that if you attack this enzyme in the liver, you'll reduce cholesterol, was not Warner Lambert and Lipitor. It was another company. In fact, there were 2 or 3 statins before the best one came along. Usually the follow-on drug does better. Note to self on that one, it's an important point. As I said, the focus is usually on a new mechanism of action, but the downside is the FDA has very little or no experience with this mechanism of action, so they're learning too. And they may not have a lot of guidance, but today, and I'll show on the slide later why first in class could be good. It was not necessarily good a few years ago. But with the revamped approach the FDA has and the collaborative approach in interacting more frequently with its customers, the pharma industry, the FDA gets educated significantly more quickly. It gives the innovator a few years head start, so they're in a good position. But as I said, the follow-on drug usually does better, and that usually comes from a different company. So we move on. I think it's another buzzword. Yeah, ADME. We're going to talk about pharmacokinetics and ADME, which is absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. That's what happens to the drug once it's going into the body. You have to account, if you like, almost for every atom that you put into the body and where it goes. And it's a math problem. What goes in has to come out, and you have to know what happened to it, how it metabolizes, and what the metabolites are, and where those metabolites go, and if they do anything along the way. It's like having if a dog rolls in mud and rushes into your house before you get it, you will scream the house to figure out exactly where that dog went and how much mess was made. You try to avoid that in the future. And you want to avoid what are called adverse events, side effects. Adverse event is the way that we talk about side effects nowadays. So we move along, you can see a chart for drug metabolism and pharmacokinetics, the cousin of ADME, but it's based on ADME. So you want to, you know what concentration, in animals, you know what concentration seems to work. You want to figure out a way to get the concentration of the drug into the plasma, the bloodstream. And you do various formulations of the drug to achieve that goal. So these pharmacokinetic studies can be quite important. So as we move on, another buzzword is new molecular entity. It's an active ingredient that the FDA has never seen before. So for example, a number of years ago, they approved caffeine as a new molecular entity. I'm sure thousands of people at the FDA were drinking coffee and taking caffeine themselves to keep them awake as they were reviewing many of these tedious documents that they get. However, no one had actually formally said, we want to use caffeine as a drug, formally as a drug, and we are applying to have caffeine approved as a drug. So it was defined as a new molecular entity. And that's important because the FDA gives a certain exclusivity on a drug if it is a new molecular entity. And another buzzword you'll hear is a new chemical entity, an NCE. You'll see that often in filings from small companies. It's defined in the Code of Federal Regulations, but it is a small molecule, whereas an NME can be a small or a large molecule. It's essentially a molecule that the FDA has never seen before as a drug. You could have been drinking it in coffee, but that doesn't count. So if we move on, I think that's it for buzzwords. Once you've demonstrated the drug acts on the target, you understand the mechanism, you can understand the side effects or the adverse events, and you don't think they're very serious, and you know how the drug is consumed, you're ready to try it on humans. So what do you do next? Well, if we move on, you have to ask permission from the FDA. You have to file a thing called an investigational new drug application. The abbreviation you'll see in the industry all the time is an IND. And the FDA has 30 days to respond to an IND. If you don't hear anything, you can assume the answer is yes and go ahead. But they will really screen it and come up with a very loud no if it's a problem. You summarize everything you did in preclinical studies, and you detail what you want to do next. And after that, you're ready to start in the clinic with clinical trials. And it's about clinical trials that I want to talk about next, starting on the next slide. It's a controlled experiment that's administered to people. They're called nowadays participants, no longer patients or subjects. In a clinical trial, they're generally called participants on websites such as clinicaltrials.gov. That's the preferred term. The gold standard in clinical trials, as Dr. Fauci has talked about, is that they're double blind. Neither the patient nor the doctor knows who's getting who's getting what medication. They are controlled and they're randomized. So you know how many people are in each group, and you randomly assign them to the group based on some random criterion. And the goal is to evaluate both safety and then the efficacy of the drug. And the idea is that participants should assume as much risk in the trial as they do in their regular lives. So you have an ethical responsibility to make sure that you are not putting patients or participants at any additional risk. And they're usually conducted in hospitals or similar clinical settings. And they're carried out under the clinical practices, which is a code for managing clinical trials. So we skip along to the next slide. Just for an overview, generally a phase 1 trial, trials are divided into 3 large areas. Phase 1, you are determining safety. So you look at patients that have no illness at all, and you see if you could administer the drug and up the dosing of the drug gradually to the level that you want it without any adverse events in any of the systems in the body. So the patients are monitored, every system in the body, the the respiratory, the lymphatic, every single system is monitored to make sure that it isn't adversely affected by this drug. Once you have got the safety profile ironed out, there's long-term studies still underway. However, then you go into phase 2, where you look at efficacy. You ideally want to get a group of patients, usually fewer than 100. Phase 1, it's 10 to 20 maybe. Phase 2, it's 100. And you will look at dosing studies for patients who have the problem. You might look at, if it's called pivotal trial, a proof of concept, you might actually do a gold standard clinical trial where you divide the subjects into 2 groups. One gets the drug, one gets a placebo, or the standard of care. You randomly assign people to each group. You don't let anyone in either group know if they're getting the novel medicine or the standard of care, and you don't let the doctor know either which he or she is administering. And those people usually at that point have the problem indication, say it's liver cancer, say it's a heart condition, whatever the illness is, the indication and no other complications. And if it can pass phase 2 successfully, then it goes into a gold standard, which is a phase 3 study. There you try to mirror the overall patient population. So you may have thousands of people in a clinical trial. It's usually multi-centered. There's oodles of different centers doing it. It's double-blind. No one knows who's getting the drug or the placebo. It's controlled. And you either get a placebo or, more commonly nowadays, the standard of care. And at all points, it has to show, certainly for phase 2 and phase 3, it has to show not only safety, definitely demonstrate efficacy as well. And we'll go through this again in the next slide, where we have a slide from a talk from Sanofi a number of years ago that just breaks it down as well, basically echoing what we talked about before. Generally, phase 1 is small, 20 to 40, 80 people. Phase 2 is up to 300. And for phase 3, you can have thousands of patients. Sorry, participants, excuse me. Moving along. Here's a breakdown from clinicaltrials.gov, a great website that shows the number of clinical trials as of May 31st been performed in the US, outside the US, and both in the US and outside America as well. So about 38% of trials are in the US, some are outside as well. Half of all trials are performed outside of the US. And the next slide is a map, which shows that right now there are this is actually as of today, second, almost 132,000 trials underway in the US. There are 38,500 in China and almost 100,000 in Europe. But they're spread all over the world. Nowadays, to have a drug approved in the US, you have to register your trial on clinicaltrial.gov. That's been a requirement for at least the last 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 years or more. So moving along, this is the growth in clinical trials. You can see it has jumped incredibly, even back, I remember when we were giving talks on this, Mark and I, in 2010, commenting, how are they finding patients for 100,000 clinical trials? It's amazing. Now, of course, we're 3.5 times that, and it continues to grow. It has tapered off this year, but that's thanks to COVID-19. Clinical trials have all but shut down. Certainly phase 1 clinical trials have stopped pretty much. There's at least 1,000 that have been postponed because of the COVID-19 problem. Because you have to bring people to a clinical settings to examine them, and with COVID-19, that's not recommended anymore. So moving along, for a clinical trial, you have to come up with some kind of endpoint. You have to describe an outcome that you want from this clinical trial. And it has to be something that's measurable, drop in blood pressure, reduction in cancerous cells, something like that. And you need to determine it before the trial begins. And for the trial to be deemed successful, you have to meet that endpoint. An example might be you lower cholesterol by 20 points, and as against a placebo or a control group. And for fatal diseases, you generally nowadays, the FDA used to talk about survivability as the ultimate endpoint, which it still is, but surrogate endpoints nowadays are successful. So for heart conditions, generally you now come up with endpoints that might suggest that the heart is getting healthy. The resting heartbeat has dropped by so many percent. That might be regarded as a good outcome. And then aside from these primary endpoints, there are on the next slide, I believe, secondary endpoints. And these are softer. They may not be quantitative. They're not really shown to demonstrate efficacy, and they can't be used to have a drug approved, but they are often very, very useful to show that a drug is working. And because you miss a secondary endpoint, really isn't necessarily the death knell for a drug. But if you hit your secondary endpoints, it's generally a very good thing. So skipping along, another buzzword which you talked about is an adverse event. It's called a side effect. I think we all know what that is. If you listen to any commercial and you haven't blocked it out, where they give that list of horrific things that could happen to you. Generally, if anything is noticed somewhat routinely in a clinical trial, it makes that list. And so they're generally listed if they are adverse events. If they're called serious adverse events, often abbreviated as an SAE, then that can generate a warning, sometimes a black box warning on a drug label. Certainly if it's serious, if it results in hospitalization, disability, or if it's deemed life-threatening in some way. And by the way, these have to be explained and explained to the satisfaction of the hospital body. There's a group that administers clinical trials in the hospital. It's an independent entity. And once these things start to emerge, if they're serious enough, a clinical trial will be shut down. The FDA will be informed. So moving along. Another buzzword is PDUFA, P-D-U-F-A, which stands for Prescription Drug Users Fee Act. Passed in 1993 under the Clinton administration. This was an effort to speed up the drug approval process. The FDA said, listen, we don't have enough reviewers and Congress will not give us enough money. So we have the following proposition. We will charge drug companies a fee, $1 million, let's say, to review their drug application. You don't have to pay that if you don't want to, but if you pay it, we will enter a contract with you and promise to review it within 10 months. If we do an accelerated review, it will be 6 months. And we will collaborate with you and have meetings with you along the way when we see issues. And generally, every company nowadays benefits from the PDUFA Act and pays up to have their drug reviewed. And as a result, the FDA has hired hundreds and hundreds more reviewers. And I'll show you a chart soon that shows that that's had a major impact on how fast drugs can go to market. And so far, at least, all indications are that it has not in any way compromised safety. If anything, it may have even improved it, as more knowledge has been gained from having a bigger collection of competent people working at FDA. FDA publishes all of this information on their website. And the interesting thing is, while major companies sometimes don't announce news about a PDUFA date, and the PDUFA date is a date that's given by the FDA after they accept your application for review, small companies always publish it. They always say, the FDA has told us that on December 16th, we will get an answer as to whether or not this drug is approved. So if we move on, I don't think, no, there's not it's just a clinical trial recap as well, but we're going to talk, if you look at the bottom, about end of phase 2 meetings, advisory committee meetings, and what happens when the PDUFA date arrives. So we skip along. This is the life of a drug candidate. As I said before, companies, emerging companies, biotechs, always report these key events. They always report when they have filed something with the FDA. Major companies don't necessarily do that. It may not be material. They generally report when they get this 74-day letter, a letter within 74 days of the FDA telling them when the FDA will make their final decision. And if there is an end of phase 2 meeting before they do the filing, that generally is reported as well. And one great source of information, and I'll talk about this a lot as we go forward, is clinicaltrials.gov. It gives a lot of details on clinical trials, as well as other detailed information about them in general. And also SEC filings, Securities and Exchange Commission filings of companies public, and gives just oodles of information. And for emerging companies, which are small, pretty much every event they have with the FDA is material, so it probably is going to be mentioned. So skipping along, this is an overview of the introduction page to the FDA. You can see all of the possible links in white there. Over on the left, you can see a link to just before on Espanol, sorry for the accent, on advisory committees. We'll talk about advisory committees in a moment. If you're retired and have free time on your hands, which generally I've noticed retired people don't, but if you do, you should think about getting on an advisory committee. It would be a lot of fun. There's FDA guidance documents. There's just incredible information there. And the site that I often look for, right down in the middle, a little bit towards the right, under food, is drugs. You click on that and you're brought to a, it's like Aladdin's cave for nerds. So we skip along. This is a link to the FDA website. As I said, a wealth of information. If you like drugs, You can access the drug approvals database, which is a good resource. You can see drug trials, snapshots of them. There's a link that gives you drug approvals reports for a week, and you can click on another link and it will show you what's happened in the last 2 weeks. It's quite large. And then advisory committees that you can get a published calendar of meetings. A lot of them have been canceled over the last few months. These are committees that meet during the approval process. They get a summary from the company, and that's summarized by an FDA reviewer. When I say summarize, it's a 100-page document which summarizes the new drug application, but there's a wealth of information in there. It's really a very interesting read very often as they go through the clinical results and critique them. And then there are professionals on this committee that are either expert in the area of treatment that the company's looking at. There may be people on the committee who are ordinary citizens that just want to serve their government in some capacity. And the FDA pays for them to come to this meeting, puts them up in a hotel, wined and dined reasonably within FDA guidelines. But they serve on this committee and they give their opinion too about whether or not the drug should be approved. And you can go on the FDA website and I believe you can apply to be in one of these advisory committees. You can do it for the Federal Reserve too. They have advisory committees for interested citizens who want to get involved. Let's move along. You don't pay anything out of pocket to do this. And the other site, clinicaltrials.gov, is where every clinical trial for a drug that wants to get approved in the US is listed. And this is the splash page for clinicaltrials.gov. That kind of yellow, maybe it's orangey patch in the middle on the left, that's actually a link for everything to do with COVID-19 and all the clinical trials that have been, there are hundreds of them now that have appeared in the last few months. But generally, you can click in over on the right towards the middle, the name of your drug, the name of the company, any search term at all, and it will give you lists of clinical trials based on that search term. Very, very useful. I generally type in the code name for a drug. That gets me the most focused response possible, generally. Or if you have the generic name, that can work too. So let's move on. So on the main FDA.gov website, you can also look at information that gives PDUFA performance. And I have links to those documents. In fact, I have those documents themselves where an independent agency, I think it's Booz Allen right now, reviews the FDA's performance in responding to new drug applications, how they interact with customers, i.e. pharmaceutical companies, and what the response rate is like. And they publish a report every 3 or 4 years or so. The latest one was 2018, and I've got some snapshots from that. So we move along. Other buzzwords are phase 2A and phase 2B. I know generally you talk about 3 phases, 1, 2, 3, but you'll hear about a phase 2B trial as well. A 2A is generally smaller. It's done in a smaller group of participants, and you're looking maybe at dosing, safety, and at efficacy as well. But a phase 2B trial, and I do want to stress a phase 2B trial is important because it is a pivotal study. It is a well-controlled study, so you're measuring it against standard of care or placebo, and you're looking at people who have the indication that you're targeting and nothing else. And you want to see how well your drug performs. It's a small group, usually up to 100, maybe 200 people. But if the drug does well in a phase 2B study, if it does really well, that's a very good sign for the phase 3 trial. If it's iffy or so-so, then I really generally don't hold out as much hope for a phase 3 trial. In my experience, a phase 3 style trial never does better, or very seldom does better, than a phase 2B. A phase 2B is very predictive of what's going to happen next. I kind of jokingly call it a phase 3 light trial. So you want a very, very good, well-defined phase 2B trial. And in the next part of this talk, I'll give you a good example for that for hepatitis C. For those of you who like statistics, you know type 1 and type 2 errors, but really, if you've got a drug that is good and it passes the clinical trial, you're happy. If you've got a drug that is bad and it fails the clinical trial, you're happy. But if you can get a false positive, if you think the drug is good, but it actually isn't, then you're going to be sad. It's a type 1 error, you don't like it. And conversely, if it passes the clinical trial, but it's a bad drug, you don't want that either. That first example is like convicting an innocent person, jury convicting an innocent person. And the second type of error is having a guilty person, but acquitting them. And that can happen in clinics as well. Generally, after the drug is approved, if it is bad, it shows up on the market, and it doesn't happen that very often nowadays. It used to happen a little bit more frequently, but it doesn't happen too often. But it's pulled from the market pretty quickly. So let's move on, because I think now we're going to go through a few other buzzwords. Skip through these quickly. Generally, superiority, you want your drug to do better than its competitor, than the standard of care. Non-inferiority trial means it's going to do as well and not better. And then you are trying to predict what will happen in the overall patient population from what you hope is a representative sample of that population. And you hear these p-values discussed now and again, and it's usually set at 0.05. And all that means is that the result that you're getting has a 5% chance of being explained just by all the random events that can happen in the universe. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that the drug is good when it passes a clinical trial. It just means there's a 95% chance, 95% probability this did not happen by chance. Is the way I'll describe it for now. So skipping along, I think we're done with the buzzwords. We talked about phase 1 before, but I do want to say that the thing that you do is when you're administering these drugs to humans is you look at what was called the no observed adverse effect level. That's the NOAEL level. This is the level in animals right before the dose that caused a problem. So let's say you put 100 milligrams into a rabbit, and the rabbit bounced around and was healthy, and then you put 101 milligrams in there, and there was a problem. It started to exhibit rashes or whatever. Then you say, well, the NOAEL level for this rabbit is 100 grams, 100 milligrams. And when you know what this level is, you cut it back usually by a factor of 100, and that's what you administer to humans. You know where you want to go because you've done your PK studies. You know what the serum concentration should be. So you will slowly increase the dose up to the level where you want, monitoring all the systems all the time, looking for adverse events. And if you don't get them, then you've got to, generally you would argue that you're presumptively a safe drug based on your phase 1 results. Skipping along to the next slide. So you're looking at dose tolerance, making sure there's no serious or even problematic toxicity issues. And you could do multiple dose studies as well. Sometimes done against a placebo, often open label, sometimes not. And you want it to match what you saw in animals, non-human animals. Moving along, we can see a phase 2 trial. Kind of a busy slide, but as I said before, here you want to start looking at efficacy. If it's a phase 2B, it's the gold standard. It's double-blind, placebo-controlled study where you are comparing it against the standard of care or placebo, and you want to see if the drug actually works. And then finally, moving along, then we're talking about other issues surrounding the phase 2 trial. But one thing you can get if you apply to the FDA for what's called a special protocol assessment, an SPA, and if you get that, you will interact a lot more frequently with the FDA. They will certainly monitor what you're up to, what you're doing, and give you advice or feedback, more correctly than advice, on how to come up with endpoints for your trial, what you need to do to make a satisfactory trial for drug approval. Let's move along. An end of phase 2 meeting is a very important meeting with the FDA, and they encourage people to schedule an end of phase 2 meeting. I think still about 80% of people have them, but everyone is open. The FDA welcomes anyone to have an end of phase 2 meeting. This is where you interact with the agency, and they will tell you what you, based on the clinical results you've got to date, what you need to do to get a drug approved. There is generally a draft guidance. I have a link there to one for weight management, but there's a draft guidance or a guidance for usually every kind of indication, and they describe what they expect to see and why they want to see it. You can discuss with them what you want to do. If you want to do something differently, and they can either say fine, or they can give you reasons why you shouldn't do that. But generally, an end of phase 2 meeting is important, and emerging companies always report, maybe not in great detail, but they will report on their website if and when they have them. Emerging companies that are publicly traded, that is, because this will be a material event. Not so much for a big company. Let's move on. And here, this is from the 2015 first cycle review performance. I looked at the 2018, it didn't have this detail in here, but it just basically shows that if companies had an end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA, there was a much greater chance that their drug was approved once the NDA, which is the new drug application, was submitted. And that's basically because they got information from the FDA as to what they need to do to get the drug successfully to the endpoint. So we move along, and this is just cheering the FDA along. They really have become extremely interactive with their customers, which is a good thing. So this is what they were doing in 2017, and this is all on their website, full details. Moving along to the next slide. The phase 3 trial is the gold standard. Here you're basically trying to replicate the overall patient population with a group that you hope is large enough to do that. And you have to account for the fact that a certain percent of people will drop out, and you have to recruit enough people so that the trial isn't destroyed if you lose too many participants. It can involve thousands of volunteers and can last for years. And it needs to show statistical significance against the control, which is usually the standard of care, as I've said before, the best care you could possibly get, or a placebo. So moving along, and the FDA normally requires 2 successful phase 3 trials to consider marketing approval. That's a bit of a typo where I said the limit is usually set at 5. It's usually the p-value is often set at 0.05, but they require 2 trials. 0.05 meaning there's a 1 in 20 chance that this happened by 1 in 20% chance that it just happened as a fluke. So 2 successful trials is generally what's required, or generally what will get you through the end goal. And each label claim that you see a company makes is supported by a phase 3 trial. So we move along to the next slide. There are many things that can jinx a phase 3 trial. Long-term toxicity studies could show up in animals. Sometimes there's pharmacology studies that aren't finalized. There could be drug-drug interactions that were not demonstrated in earlier trials because you were just looking at people who had the indication and were not taking any other form of medication. So let's move on to the next slide. This again is, well, this one's from GlaxoSmithKline, where it talks about the attrition rate. You might have 10,000 candidates in drug discovery, maybe 10 to 20 will make it into preclinical testing. It could be 5 to 10 candidates in phase 1. And by the time you get to the drug approval process, there's 1 left. It's extremely expensive and time consuming to get a drug to market. So if we move along again, and this is just what can happen. You could get a good outcome for all parties. They could demonstrate that the drugs work. And let's say that the drug is neither safe nor effective. A good outcome would be that the drug fails in the clinic. That's what we want. And the main goal of the FDA is to avoid approving a drug that is bad. They don't want to say we get marketing approval for this drug, and it turns out this drug is not safe and not effective. And the company also wants to avoid falling into the trap where it demonstrates that a bad drug is actually a good one. And I think I talked about those outcomes, those are smiley faces earlier. And in 2017, 57%, there should be a percent sign, it disappeared on me, or maybe I forgot it, of phase 3 trials, that failed were because of lack of efficacy. They did not pass that bar. And 17% failed because safety concerns popped up. And 25% of trials in oncology fail to enroll enough participants. So they often have to extend the dates, or they have to redo the trial at some point as well. Only 3 to 5% of eligible adults are interested in participating in the clinical trial anyway. So we move along. One of the benefits actually of participating is the medication is for free, and you will get the standard of care if you don't get the investigational new drug. You get reimbursed for time and expenses. You don't get paid. And this is usually based on the length of the time of the study, number of overnight stays in clinics, and the number of outpatient visits that you have to make. But the reimbursement can vary from hundreds to thousands of dollars. It is reimbursement for your time and your any expenses you might incur, and all the medications are paid for as well to do with the clinical trial. Let's move along. They are expensive. I cite an example of a 1,000-patient phase 3 study where they estimated that the cost was almost $90,000 per patient. In 2015-16, they estimate that the median cost of the trial was $19 million. Actually, I know what happened here. I was deleting dollar signs and percent signs from the table, and it looks like I thought I'd highlighted what it needed to do, but it decided to eradicate it from the document overall. And pivotal trials, these again that are against a placebo or standard of care, can run up to $30 million in average each. And the median cost is about $41,000 per patient, $3,500 per patient visit. So these things are pretty expensive. These are good numbers to know when you're estimating how much a company's going to have to pay for a clinical trial, how much it's raised, and whether or not it will have to go back to the market and get more. It's good to have these numbers in your back pocket somewhere. You can Google them time and time again to get updates, because there's a lot of free information out there, and you'll generally see a consensus of these numbers as well. How much time do I have left? Moving on. I think I'm over time.
Yeah, we're at 9:37. We're going to try to be done in the next 8 minutes. Can you?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay.
So you're demonstrating safety and efficacy. You're making inferences from a small to a group to a large patient population, and you want to try to capture all serious adverse events, but you have to monitor it once the drug is approved, because that is a very high goal, to capture all serious adverse events. So moving along, the average time for phase 1 trial is 2.6 years. You can see the rest of the numbers there, but the one that I want to stress is the overall time for oncology drugs in the clinic is about 13 years. It's 6 to 7 years for drugs in general, 13 years for oncology drugs. And about half of the pipelines in Europe and the US are now in oncology. And that's why I say we're in a bubble. This will not last. We move on. The FDA has been handling a lot of the new drug applications recently. Once you've finished in the clinic, you formulate a new drug application, submit it to the agency for review, and it receives about 44% of submissions in the very last quarter of every year. It's been getting about 150 to 160 new drug applications each year for the past 3 or 4 years, so it's gone way over 100. So moving along, what the FDA does is once it gets the letter, it responds to you within about a month or two, and lets you know what the PDUFA date is. And when it reaches that date, you can get one of two responses. Ideally, you want a response that says, congratulations, your drug is approved for marketing. This is going to be the brand name for your drug, and this is the label that you need to affix to it. Or you could get a complete response letter, which says that there are defects in your submission, and this is what you need to do to fix to have the submission reviewed again. So if we move along, some buzzwords: fast track. That just means that the FDA believes that this drug should move through the clinic more quickly, and it will discuss with you how to do that, and it will work closely with you, with your endpoints, your clinical protocols, to make sure that you're doing things correctly. A breakthrough therapy is a therapy that performs significantly better than anything that's in the market, and generally, if you apply for fast track, you will get fast track approval as well. But again, you'll be much more interactive with FDA if you've got a breakthrough therapy. And priority review just means the FDA will commit to reviewing your application in 6 months instead of the standard 10. And by the way, for many years, the FDA used to respond immediately at the end of 6 months or 10 months. Recently, for some drugs that it believes are critical to get to the market, they've done it in 2 or 3 months. They've done it really, really quick. And if we move along, this is just showing the total number of new drug applications, small molecule, versus biologics for the last number of years. You can see that it's a breakdown between standard in blue and priority review in gray. So a lot of them get that 6 month review. And if we move to the next slide, again, this is the FDA website. So we'll skip on, where we're going to just look at the first cycle review performance in 2015. And basically, compared to, say, 2008, which is the last time I presented this, or this information was available for a presentation, it has improved dramatically. They have been able to move a lot more drugs through the approval process faster than in years gone by. So we move on. A complete response letter is not necessarily bad news. The one thing I want to stress, if your company gets one of these, and it's because there are issues with what's called the CMC section, chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, those are fixable, and generally 90%, more than 90% are fixable in a very short period of time. If there's no efficacy problems, if it's just the CMC, often the stock price gets pummeled. It's generally a good time to buy that company. So let's skip on. I think we should have a chart. You can tell me when we have to wrap up, but this shows the median time for reviewing new drug in biologic applications has been declining. That's good. FDA is speeding things up. And if we move along to the next slide, you can see that the first cycle review has been increasing. In other words, the applications are in such good condition that the FDA is able to pass them on the first review and not issue a complete response letter. So the industry is doing that. So if we move on to the next slide, this is a very busy slide, which I suggest you might want to download, but it just shows the number of drugs in the clinic, each of the phases, filed or marketed from 2014 to 2019, and you can see pipelines are full and getting fuller. If we move on to the next slide, an important trend is the number of drugs. 38% are small molecule, 35% or 33% of all recent FDA approvals are in oncology, and close to half of drugs in the clinic are now in cancer. So oncology is growing aggressively. It is a bubble. Something has to give, and it looks like it will be cancer. Cancer will get a whack soon. So we move on. I'm not saying it'll be cured, but I'm going to say it'll be maybe put into a category of a chronic condition. Pharmaceutical companies are accused of price gouging, and it's not an unfair comment. When you dig into the details, you see that whereas 2% of scripts in the US were written for biologics in 2017, they accounted for 37% of the spending. That's where the money is going. It's in the biologics. There's not as many of them around, and not a lot of them get administered, but they are incredibly expensive compared to small molecule drugs over the right. And if we skip along to the next slide, it just shows the total number of biologics and small molecules that have been approved, whereas everyone is predicting that biologics will take over. That's not the case at all. It's still dominated by small molecule drugs. On the next slide, it shows the chance of progressing through the clinic based on the indication. And the take-home lesson, the column over on the right shows the overall chance of approval from preclinical through phase 1. And you can see it's only 3.4% for an oncology drug, whereas it is for ophthalmology or vaccines, it's 33%. So based on when you're looking at a pipeline, if you know what the indication is, what general area the company's looking at, you can look at this table and figure out what the chances are that this company will actually get a drug. And the bottom two lines are interesting because it shows the overall approval rate, but the bottom line shows the overall approval rate percentage if you do not include cancer or oncology drugs in there. It jumps up dramatically. So skipping along, well, we can skip this slide as well because we're not going to talk about generics. What I want to do on the next slide is talk to you about looking at Crunchbase, and I'm going to wrap up soon because if we skip to the next few slides, I can go through these quickly. These are venture capitalists to look for. There's a list of about 100 that I have that are high quality, and if they haven't been investing in a company, it's a good sign. On the next slide, I can just show you that for investor, I've summarized some of the things we've talked about before. Basically, if it's a phase 2 trial and it does really well, phase 2B, that's a very good sign. If you move along to the next slide, in this, which has now become a movie, you want to see if your company has a track record, if it's a biotech company of raising money. And you check on clinicaltrials.gov to see how the trial is enrolling. So that is a signal that it has premier investigator support, which is, it means it is a successful company that's able to attract the best in the clinical world to administer its drug to participants. And on the next slide, we just look at fundraising over the last 20 years. These numbers are in billions. Rounds are generally A round, B round, C round. Some things are called a seed round if it's early on and the company is very experimental. But the bottom line, yet again, is the thing I want to show you, and that is that yes, companies raise billions of dollars from venture capital, but it's when it's acquired, that's where the big money is. And that's what makes biotech investing potentially so successful, because a company in its early stage can increase by a factor of 50 to 100 when it is acquired, in the best of all possible worlds. Makes for a great investment. And this shows the amount of fundraising activity for the last 10 years. And I just want, there's one or two slides I want to get to just because I think they're interesting if we move on. It shows where the number of companies and the number that are small molecules, and the amount of billions of dollars that were raised by state. and I've got 3 countries down at the bottom, but you can see that California and Massachusetts and New Jersey kind of dominate still. And if we move on, we can see things broken down even more refined by zip code. The number of companies, this is San Diego, 92101, 186 companies that have raised $10.9 billion in the last 15 years. And so anyway, those are dogs barking, so that's a good sign. So if we move on, stop talking. Interestingly, about 2/3 of venture money just goes into 66 zip codes in the US, 1 in 4 into 3 different zip codes, and 1/3 of all biotechs are found in just 15 zip codes. It's a really concentrated industry, and that's echoed in the next slide as well. Whereas there's 4 states that attract 3 in 4 venture dollars, and 90% of all biotech venture dollars just go into 10 states, and big pharma is equally as concentrated. And I think that is it. No matter what you're interested in, I think understanding the drug approval process is key. It's critical to be a good investor. Extremely risky, as Marcus pointed out very clearly, but a great font of knowledge. So I think that's it. I do apologize for running over. And yeah, I wanted to suggest a follow-up study where we'll use what we've learned here to look at real-world examples. Hepatitis C is an interesting case study, as is sickle cell anemia, sickle cell disease, more properly called. But if you have specific companies you want me to look at or you want us to discuss together, I think that'd be a good idea if you can let me know. I know I've got a number of suggestions from people, but obviously there's so much to cover this weekend. Didn't have enough time, so apologies for that.
No problem, Hugh.
Mark,
we appreciate it. One of the things we've talked about is 6 or 8 weeks out, perhaps getting together again and taking some specific case examples of companies that have specific solutions in the pipelines and basically just walking through what's the likelihood that this thing will ever make it, track records, that kind of stuff. So I think we can work that within the community and figure out what we can look at some of those venture capital firms that have been the most successful and see what they're after these days. So let me just close with one of my slides, the rest of the story, that $10,000 invested in Vertex, which became the sofa in our lower level. If we had, instead of not selling that at the end of the year, by the way, my wife became a little bit nauseous when she saw this number this afternoon. If we hadn't bought the sofa known as Hugh, that $10,000 would now be worth $98,700. That's 18% per year. Yippee-ki-yay. So yes, it can be rewarding. It can, from what I've seen, require incredible amounts of patience. It can require knowing some of those keywords that Hugh was talking about. Those CRLs will drive the traders crazy. If you watch them on the online and social media, the company known as Vertex is now almost a $5 billion company, continuing to grow at 20%. As far as I know, Hugh, they still are predominantly cystic fibrosis. They are working in a couple of other areas. Maybe we could take a look at that, but they've become a company with no long-term debt and $4 billion in their checkbook. Just
I actually
fascinating.
plan to look at that because there's a good example of hepatitis C, and they also have a venture arm, and they've been investing in some interesting companies.
Yep, maybe we can dig those out and take a look at what can that do to add to this picture going forward, from a probability standpoint. So I think it could prove to be very interesting to walk through a few of those. In addition to, as many of the people that are here know, we have been tracking Ardelyx, ARDX. That's one that will probably come up in conversation also. They started off focusing on, was it irritable bowel syndrome solutions that have become very helpful in kidney treatments and that kind of stuff. So that's something we can take a look at also in greater detail. But with that, I think we'll just
Mark, we're also getting the suggestion to perhaps look at CYTK.
CYTK, is that familiar, Hugh? Do you have a company name, Ken?
Sorry, that's Cytokinetics, right?
Yeah, I don't have a company name, just the ticker.
Cytokinetics?
Sounds like Cytokinetics.
What type of general theme or area are we talking there?
The participant just put down in the question box CYTK with a question mark, and now he's answering yes, it is Cytotech. It is the company you mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd love to put that one in the review as well. It's a very interesting company. It's been around actually for quite some time. And so, generally you might be critical of a company like that because you expect to have more drugs brought to market. But yeah, I would like to have a look at that one as well.
Okay, we're getting a lot of people just throwing tickers up at me right now. First of all, I know a lot of these tickers, and they're not anything to do with the drug industry. So let's focus, folks, just a little bit on drug companies, biotechs, or pharmaceuticals that you might like to have included in a study. I am getting a lot of people that would like to take a look at Merck's pipeline too, Hugh, if that's a possibility to work into anything.
Yeah, Merck is a good one.
I guess, and to that end, I think what we would like to do is go ahead and submit your tickers. Try to keep them to the biotech or pharma industries, but we, Ken and I are talking about even ramping up in an even more arduous fashion this year, the small company thing that we do Halloween each year, starting earlier, and also making an effort to find, 2, 4, 5 maybe companies that fit the description of what we're talking about here. So that'll be part of this effort also.
Okay, Mark, are you going to jot down from the question box? We're getting Ionis, IONS, SUPN, REGN, RGNX, and I was just picking out the ones that I knew were biotechs. Also FATE.
Yeah.
Okay, and Regeneron, I think that's REGN, Regeneron.
Yeah, that one's come to the roundtable a couple of times.
Okay,
very good to us.
So that gives us a huge group of stocks to take a look at. We couldn't possibly cover them all, but we'll give a start on the whole thing.
Well, I do think it'll be interesting when we cross-profile some of those more successful venture capital firms. Many of the people in the audience already know that we watch Chris Jenner at Rock Springs Capital pretty closely, and we'll obviously be paying very close attention to any activity by that T. Rowe Price Health Sciences Fund also. Because again, as we've kind of shown here with a couple of examples, if you can be blessed with one of these, just as an example, last Christmas, we bought shares of Ardelyx at $2 a share. Last time I checked, it was trading somewhere in the neighborhood of $8. That's not too shabby for a return on a non-core special situation.
I'm going to do a shout out, Mark, to one of our former investment club members, Matt Spielman, and Matt is recommending AIMT, and he usually has some pretty interesting ideas, so maybe that one goes on the list as well.
Absolutely. Greetings, Matt. All right. Well, Hugh, any final comments or wrap up or encouragement from?
No, I'll stress what you've said often, that these definitely are not core holdings that I've come up with or suggested here. And, a small part of a portfolio, and I just 20 plus years ago, I always found it useful to have something like this in the portfolio, because back when I was buying only Aflacs and Upjohns and McDonald's of the world, once I introduced Vertex or a biotech where it could go to zero overnight without any warning, it really made me focus much more intently on what was going on in the market overall. Even though it was like 2% of the overall portfolio, it became 90% of the obsession, if you will.
Sure. And
so it was good.
All right, and Ken, we do have a roundtable coming up in, what's the actual date on the next roundtable?
I have no idea. Last Tuesday in June, Mark. Okay. Here, I do have a calendar. It's the 30th, Mark.
Okay.
30th of June. Okay.
So that's our next time together. I don't think we'll do much between now and then, but again, if anybody out there has thoughts and suggestions on this topic and a follow-up session, We did this one other time 8 years ago, and we had a really nice 1-2 punch when it came to this subject. So would just encourage people we can make it even better this time.
Okay, so
Thanks, everyone.
we'll definitely have a date for people at the June 30th roundtable about when the follow-up to this would be then, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming this evening. A nice size audience. We held the audience, Hugh, even though it ran a little bit long. So I want to thank you for the work you did in preparing this, Mark and Hugh. It's always appreciated by our audience. And we hope to see a lot of you at the next roundtable on June 30th. Until then, have a safe and delightful summer. That's one of the 3 months we get for summer here in Michigan. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night, all.
Bye.